So, Roman architecture and art. Well, the simple fact is that the archaeological evidence that we have indicates that there was really nothing or not very much at the site that becomes Rome until the middle of the 8th century. There's some evidence for Bronze Age activity there. So something going on there in about 1100 BC. But the first real evidence for occupation at the site of Rome dates to the middle of the 8th century. And the evidence shows that Rome essentially was nothing more than a small village until the 6th century BC. So what this means is if we want to understand the origins of the architecture and art of the Roman period, we've got to look at the architecture and art of the other peoples in Italy in the time before the 6th century BC. This is where, of course, we always have a problem. Archaeology is not very precise. But what our excavations throughout the whole of Italy have shown is that the beginnings of the Iron Age, so roughly 1000 BC, people in the northwest part of Italy were using the same type of pottery, impasto ware. Impasto ware is a rather greyish-brown colour like this. It's rather simply made. It's not particularly beautiful or anything like this. But what we find in the northwest of Italy, the area that in Roman times is known as Etruria, is evidence for a series of villages in which all the people are using this type of pottery. These people are also burying their dead in one of two different ways. Some of the villages we find inhumation burials. An inhumation burial, the body is put in the ground, probably wrapped up in a cloth, but we don't know. But other villages practice cremation. So they burn the body before it's deposited in the ground. What we do know about these people seems to indicate they've got a common sort of lifestyle, they live in villages, they're using the same general type of pottery. But this is the time before written history. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what other peoples called them. All we know is that in the northwest part of Italy, the area that is known to the Romans, much later as Etruria, we have these people sharing the same types of pottery, same types of houses, not exactly the same types of burial methods. Now, for archaeologists dealing with times before written history, we use the word culture to identify a group of people that seem to share the same characteristics. I mean, if you look around Bilkent, you can identify a jeans culture. How many Bilkent students wear jeans? You know, it's that type of thing. A jet phone culture. There's also an iPad culture in some parts of Bilkent. You get the idea of what we mean by a culture. So archaeologists refer to these people who are using the same types of pottery, living in the same types of villages in a very restricted area. We call them the peoples of the Villanovan culture. Villanovan because the first site where they were properly excavated was a place called Villanova, which means the new villa. This map shows you the Villanovan culture around about 8th century BC, so try and ignore that patch up there. We're really looking at this area here for the Villanovan culture. We know that the Villanovan peoples were just one of different groups of peoples living in Italy. When we get the first writing in Italy, we find out most people are speaking a different type of, or one or other of an Italian type language. But the area of the Villanovans, Etruria, a different language altogether. We do know that the Villanovan culture seem to have been the first people in Italy to start using iron. Well, that's not really surprising in a way, because the area of Etruria is incredibly rich in iron deposits. I'll come back to that in a moment. When we look at the common characteristics of the Villanovan people, we find that those that bury their dead in cremation burials usually buried them in what the Italians call a tomba apposa, which consists of a very large jar, roughly about that sort of high. Inside this would be a pottery urn for holding the burnt ashes of the dead person and a few other bits and pieces. Well, these tombeaux posa are very important to us because these house urns give us an indication of what Villanovan houses look like. We do have some archaeological evidence for Villanovan houses at the beginning of the Iron Age, so 1000 BC down to about 800 BC. They're made of mud brick and wood. No stone is used in them. Very simple houses like this. This is one of these house urns, but it gives us an idea of what the Villanovan houses would have looked like. This is an archaeological example showing the wooden framework. These are what we call post holes, wooden post in there supporting a simple wooden roof. And again, we've got another example of a house urn there showing us the same type of details that we can see in the archaeological evidence. In fact, if you go to some parts of central Italy today, you'll find that shepherds still build huts very much like this, although usually with a stone foundation rather than being entirely of wood. We don't really know very much about the Villanovan culture when all is said and done. We can see their artifacts, their weapons, they had a very characteristic form of architecture. But we do know for certain, as I've already mentioned, is that the area that the Villanovan culture people occupied is an area rich in metal deposits. This gives you some idea of the type of metal deposits to be found in what the Romans knew as Etruria. We don't know what this region was called at the beginning of the Iron Age. And you can see, for example, it's a place where there is copper. Copper is needed to make bronze. But the area of Etruria is also one of the very few areas in Europe where you can find tin. And you need tin to mix with copper to make bronze. So you can see that from an early date in the Bronze Age, there's good evidence for bronze work in this particular region. There's also quite large deposits of mercury. Where you need mercury for gold working, gold extraction, there's large deposits of silver as well. And I mentioned in the introductory class how the island of Elba is full of hematite. Hematite is the raw material from which we make iron. And on this diagram they've indicated with these green blocks where hematite was found, including an island you're all familiar with, Giglio Island, where a rather large ship went aground when the captain was having a party the other week. So Giglio Island, which is just down here. The ship was actually sailing from Civitavecchia, which is just over there. These very rich metal deposits meant that from an early date, in the Bronze Age already, traders from other parts of the Mediterranean were coming to this region to get metal, to take it back to their own region, to work it into different types of metal goods. And what we do find in some Villanovan graves is wonderful evidence for this type of trade contact. We see this in the form of what we call luxury goods. What we find in some graves, the Villanovan culture, the richer graves, are objects like this. This is a piece of alabaster, which probably comes from Asia Minor. The style of decoration is very much familiar to Asia Minor. Objects of an early type of glass, which must have come from either Syria or from Egypt. Ostrich eggs, which are carved with a decoration which have to come from North Africa. Ivory plaques, carved with representations of animals, again from North Africa. This is the piece of amber. Well, amber, a brown semi-precious stone, amber is only found on the north coast of Poland and Germany. It's not found anywhere else. So, not direct trade necessarily, but somehow some people in the Villanovan culture have got access to really luxury imported goods like this. It's very difficult to make out, but it is actually carved with a representation of a seated figure You can see the stomach muscles there, the beard and the head going around like that. And then over there also a later form of Egyptian glass. So the Villanovan people, the people of the Villanovan culture, the earliest people of Italy that we can really identify, were becoming quite wealthy in the Bronze Age, going into the earlier Iron Age, thanks to the trade in metal. Most of these traders came from what we call Greece, from Corinth in particular, on the west side of modern Greece. Many of these traders basically had to sail around up the coast of Italy to get there. So the route from Corinth over here would take them up the coast of Italy. And what these Greek traders saw was that there were large areas of Italy that were basically not lived in. They were unoccupied. Now, starting in about 1000 BC, going down to about 800 BC, we see a process of Greek colonization of the Mediterranean world. If we are to believe the stories, and they seem to have a good degree of truth in them, many Greek cities, existing Greek cities, the populations were growing just simply too large. So young people would be sent out to go and build a colony somewhere else. Well, some of these people made their way into Asia Minor, eventually down the coast of Syria and Phoenicia, even into North Africa. Some at a later date made their way into the Black Sea. We see Greek colonies going into the extreme western Mediterranean. But the ones we're concerned about is the intensive Greek colonization of southern Italy and the island of Sicily. Now, when I talk about Italy, I don't talk about Italy in the modern sense, which is Italy and Sicily, because as far as I'm concerned, Sicily is a separate place altogether. It really is very separate. But much more to the point, what we find happening is that starting probably around about 850, there's lots of arguments about the dating of this, we get the establishment of a series of colonies of Greek people all around southern Italy and in Sicily as well. These people bring with them all the aspects of Greek culture, everyday life, the Greek language, the idea of wine drinking, olive oil, etc., for cooking, for washing in and so forth. Greek ideas of dress. These are little islands of Greekness in Italy and Sicily. They're surrounded by people who don't speak Greek. They don't move all the existing people out, but basically little islands of Greek speakers. It's a wonderful comment, I think it's by Plato, and he talks about the colonization of the Mediterranean by the Greeks. And he talks about how all the Greek colonies are set around the Mediterranean, just like a pond with lots of frogs sitting around it, croaking away in their language that nobody else can understand. And it's a very good example. So intensive was the Greek cultural aspect of this whole area that the Romans knew it as Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. As far as the Romans were concerned, Greece was just a small part of what is now roughly modern Albania, actually, the modern Greece. But this was Greater Greece as far as the Romans were concerned. This area now starts taking on all the visible aspects of Greek culture. In fact, if you want to see some of the best surviving examples of Greek temple architecture, you go to southern Italy, or you go to Sicily, or you go to parts of Asia Minor. Asia Minor, Anatolia, Italy and Sicily have got much better examples of Greek temple architecture than anywhere in Greece outside of Athens. This, for example, is what we see at the settlement of Paestum, not too far from Pompeii, just a little bit south of Pompeii and Naples. Here you can see two of the temples. There's a third one just over there, beautifully preserved, excellent examples of temple architecture. This is an overhead view of one of the ones at Paestum. All it's missing really are the roof timbers with the stone tiles on the top. Here on Sicily, at Agrigento, on the southwest corner of the island, again a wonderful series of temples. There's about 5 altogether, of which this one is the best preserved because it was converted into a church at a later date. So we start to find Greek culture established in the southern part of Italy. But these colonies, traders from these colonies, are increasing their contact with the peoples in northwest Italy. From about the 8th century BC, we start hearing about Etruria, the peoples who lived there, the Etruscans. And what we start to find is that within the area of Etruria, more and more evidence for contact with Magna Graecia and Greece itself. As far as we can make out, by about 750 BC, the Etruscans, as they were known to the Romans, had established a whole series of quite large settlements around here. The Etruscans had grown very rich through trade with Greater Greece, Magna Graecia, and also Greece itself. The people in this region start to take on aspects of Greek cultural life. One of the first things they do is they stop using the impasto ware and they start making this. We call it Etrusco-Corinthian ware. The older name for it is Pontic ware, because it's also found in the Black Sea area. In the Black Sea area, it's locally made pottery that's copying the pottery from Corinth in Greece. In Etruria, Etrusco-Corinthian ware, again, it's copying sort of Greek patterns to a certain extent, Corinthian patterns of pottery. These are early examples there, and here we see as time goes by, the potters in Etruria begin to develop their skills and make even more fantastic examples of Greek-type pottery. They also make some rather simpler pottery, a type of pottery we know as bucchero ware. Bucchero ware is very shiny, very black. It can be polished so that it has an almost silver look to it. Well, if you look at silver that's not been properly looked after, it gets tarnished. It goes rather dark. It takes on a dark greyish colour. So bucchero ware looks like tarnished silver, old silver that's not been polished. It's obviously meant to copy silver vessels. But the really interesting thing is bucchero ware copies exactly types of pottery popular in Greece for use in the symposium. The symposium, not like today where a group of learned intellectuals sit around and stroke their beards and have a very intellectual discussion. The symposium is a kind of semi-formal dinner and dance event. Very popular in Greek culture, men only. The Etruscans change it slightly. So we see examples of pottery like this, bucchero ware. The Etruscans are making copies, which they can sell cheaply, copies of silver pottery, silver drinking vessels, which are specifically designed in Greek culture for use in the symposium. And what's even funnier is we find these being exported to Corinth and Athens, and potters in Corinth and Athens start making local copies there as well. So this was a very nice form of pottery. These fashions in pottery are being adopted by the Etruscans between about 800 and 700 BC. And it's roughly at the end of that period, about 700 BC, that the Etruscans, as we know them, take on another idea from the Greeks. The idea of writing. Well, they took the Greek alphabet. They modelled their alphabet at first on the existing Greek alphabet, which of course is copied from the peoples of Phoenicia, roughly modern Lebanon. And here you see the Western Greek, the older Greek versions of the letters going right through the Etruscan types, early to later, and the modern equivalents there. Thanks to the fact they copied Greek letters, we know what the sounds of these letters are. But their language is not Greek. Because we can read their writing, we know what the words sound like, but the words don't make sense. Because the simple fact is the Etruscan language is a non-Indo-European language. All the languages of modern Europe belong to the Indo-European language group. They're all related. Now, one of the great things about being English is not that everybody else speaks English, but it gives you a straight leap into learning French and German, because so many English words are taken from French and German, Indo-European languages. Right? They're all related. There's only 2 languages in modern Europe that are not Indo-European, Albanian and the Basque language of North Spain and South France. The Etruscan language is non-Indo-European, which means we don't know who the Etruscans were, what they called themselves, where they came from. We can only assume that they are the original inhabitants of Italy before all those people speaking Italian-type languages arrived there, so from the Bronze Age onwards. One Greek writer says that they came from Lydia, which is possible, but there's no relationship between their language and what we know of Lydian language in Anatolia. The Hittites, by the way, also spoke an Indo-European language, for those of you who don't know that, and that's the oldest Indo-European language that we know of. Well, as I said, we don't know anything about the Etruscan language. There is, unfortunately, only one inscription which gives us a version in another language of an Etruscan inscription. These are 3 gold plates that were found at a place called Frigi. You can't see terribly clearly what's on them there. A drawing makes it much clearer. Here we have the Etruscan written on 2 of these plates, and notice that Etruscan is actually written from right to left, not left to right. This is Phoenician. This is where the Greeks got their alphabet from. We can read Phoenician. The Phoenician inscription says, "This is a summary of the prayer that the Etruscans give to their god." So we know that that is a prayer to Etruscan gods. We can get the sense of it, but this is a summary. It doesn't give us a direct translation. So we can read Etruscan inscriptions in the sense of we know what the sounds are, but we can't understand them, except when it comes to common names, that sort of thing. The increasing wealth of the Etruscan peoples and this increasing influence from the Greeks of Magna Graecia and from further afield means that we start to see in Etruria large numbers of imported Greek pots. This is an example of an early Attic black figureware amphora, we would call it, black figure because the figures are in black. Attic because this was made in Athens around about 600, 650 BC or so. These would have been very expensive pieces of pottery at the time. We believe, in actual fact, analysis of the price of the pottery indicates that they're probably quite cheap. But if you wanted to buy one of these complete today, start thinking 7 figures and go up. I mean, they're a lot more expensive today, complete. So much of this type of pottery was imported into Etruria because the Etruscans were getting richer and richer thanks to the metal trade, that if you want to see the best examples of early Greek pottery, you go to Tarquinia Museum to the north of Rome. It was buried with all the people there, boom. And the best examples, the most extensive collections are in Etruria, the modern province of Tuscany. The evidence indicates that what we also start to see is that this was such a wealth-making trade that Greek potters move to Etruria. They leave their hometown in modern Greece and settle in Etruria. This is an example of black figureware made by a painter, not a potter we know as the Makala painter, after the man who first identified him. A very distinctive style of painting. But analysis of the clay indicates it has to come from Etruria. But it's a beautiful example of what we might think of as archaic Greek black figure painting. A lot of this is made, obviously, in direct copies of existing Greek styles. But we also begin to see the local Etruscans making their own versions of this type of pottery as well. So later Etrusco-Corinthian ware you've got here, but you've also got Etruscan-made black figureware here. Analysis of the clays, the artistic style makes it quite clear these are Etruscan. This is perhaps the best example of all. Broadly speaking, just looking at it in a very general way, you think it's a lovely piece of black figureware standing about that high. It shows a boxing scene, but the hairstyles on the people who are boxing are Etruscan hairstyles. They're not Greek hairstyles. So again, this is something that's made in Etruria. Well, this Greek influence on the Etruscans, the result of trade, obviously some peoples in Etruria started to get very rich. They're buying their pottery, they're taking on other aspects of Greek cultural life. And this is why the Etruscans are the first people in Italy to introduce the idea of monumental tombs. They get the idea from Greek-speaking peoples in Magna Graecia in Greece itself. The tombs are all of basically the same type. They're what we call a tumulus tomb, just as in Turkish, a tumulus, tumuli is plural, meaning it's a mound of earth, a circular mound of earth, built on top of a stone foundation. These are the ones at Cerveteri. These are the best collection you can see. A rather blurred shot, but you can see how they've built the foundation there of stone blocks with the mound of earth on the top. The diameter roughly in the order of about 10 metres. They're not terribly large. Most of these tumuli have unfortunately been robbed a long time ago in the past. A few have been excavated in a reasonably professional way in the 18th and 19th century. All the evidence indicates that the people buried in these tumuli, who were normally inhumed, so their bodies were placed complete, were buried with an enormous range of imported and locally made artefacts. This is the contents of one tomb. We don't know which tomb, unfortunately. It's a tomb that was dug up somewhere around Cerveteri, and the contents were given to the Pope at the time, so they were kept together. We're fortunate. And you can see you've got these bronze lampstands for candles or for oil lamps. You've got these bronze buckets, bronze jugs. These are almost certainly locally made. Then you've got these dishes which may be locally made, they may have been made in Greece. This is red figureware in which the figures are painted in red. So they're likely to have been made in Greece, but we can't actually be certain. They've not been analysed. But again, these are things that we associate with the symposium, the wine drinking party that men have. This contains the wine, this is what you drink the wine out of. You've got more metal vessels down here, and more metal vessels over there as well. So the people buried in these tombs are incredibly rich. Interestingly enough, what we have here is a roasting fork. Right? Originally with a wooden handle, those three prongs at the end, what you put the joint of meat on, to cook it at a kind of barbecue. And we find similar examples influenced by the same idea in Iron Age Britain. So we get some idea of the aspects of life that people shared. And here we have an alabastron, made of alabaster, probably from Asia Minor, Anatolia, but we can't be absolutely certain. Now, most of the tombs at Cerveteri, as I said, were excavated or rather robbed a long time ago. It was only in the 19th century that people started to get the idea of keeping the contents of tombs together and preserving them instead of selling them. This is mainly because in the early 19th century, the Pope controls some parts of Italy, the French other parts of Italy, local rulers in even more parts of Italy. One of the few tombs at Cerveteri that was not robbed in the past and that was excavated in relatively recent times, but 1820, 1830, is the Reggiolini Galassi tomb. Reggiolini Galassi, the name of the person who actually found it and who excavated it. This was a tomb that was probably made sometime between 650 and 600 BC. Classic Cerveteri type tumulus. You've got stone foundations with the earth mound on top. Underneath this is a rock-cut tomb itself. You go down the steps into the entrance. Now most of this is cut out of the rock, but actually when you get inside you find it slightly different. The tomb itself, as you can see from the plan here, is a rather odd one. In fact, there's nothing else quite like it at Cerveteri. And there's a lot of problems with interpreting this tomb because, unfortunately, the records aren't particularly good. But basically, you come in through the entranceway, and you have this long passageway, the sides of which are covered with representations of shields. There are two oval chambers. The one on this side contained a cremation burial of a man and various grave goods, objects he was buried with. In the centre of the tomb was a wooden cart, I'll come back to that, with a bronze bed frame on it. And then at the end of the tomb, there was the inhumation, the burial of a woman. It's an important thing to note, actually, because, as I said at the beginning, we often identify cultures by common features. Well, in this single tomb, we've got the man was cremated, his body was burnt, but the woman was inhumed, buried whole. Now, does this mean a difference in the sexes? Or what? We simply don't know the answer to that. Well, this main chamber was carved mainly through the rock, but provided, this part was above the ground level, so it's provided with a small roof of cut stone like that. The finds from this tomb are not complete. Unfortunately, some of them have disappeared, are some of the most extraordinary finds that we've ever seen. It just gives you some idea of what's been lost from the other tombs at Cerveteri which have been robbed. So, for example, here we have this wooden cart. Some people call it a chariot, but to me a chariot's got two wheels. This has got four wheels, it's a cart. The wood had all disappeared, of course, but what had survived was the bronze decoration along the side, allowing us to reconstruct this as a four-wheeled wagon like this, originally with bronze tyres, that bronze decoration as well. There's some argument as to where the bed frame was found. The sources aren't quite clear. Some sources seem to indicate it might have been inside the cart. Other sources suggest it was found somewhere else in the tomb. But it begins to give you an idea of how sophisticated the Etruscans were, the wealthier Etruscan people. The woman's grave, or the woman's body, was decorated with an enormous amount of gold. I couldn't find a picture of it, unfortunately, but the whole of her front was covered with a single piece of gold sheet, very heavily decorated. At her shoulders, she had a fibula. Fibula is a fancy word for a brooch, so remember that one because it will come up. This is a bow fibula, used for tying two pieces of cloth together or a cloak over the shoulders, and you can see you've got the spring there, the pin there goes into the catch at that particular point there. But she was also buried with this. This is another brooch. This is something like 15 centimetres high. It's an incredible piece of workmanship. It's decorated on the top with groups of lions. Well, lions aren't found in Italy, so this represents some kind of outside influence on the Etruscan people. It may even have come from somewhere outside of Italy. And it's got these beautiful little drops of gold attached to the base there. And this is gold wire that's been wrapped up to make those little bars there. Wonderful piece of incredibly heavy jewellery. She was also provided with these gold bracelets. And these are really rather mysterious in many ways. What you have over the top of the bracelet is a repeated scene of three women. You can't say much more about it than they are three women. They're all holding palm leaves. Well, palm leaves we tend to associate much more with Syria, that sort of area, Egypt and anywhere else, although palms do grow in the southern part of Italy. They don't grow in the northern part of Italy, not very well in Etruria. But then what we find, unfortunately I couldn't find a photograph, what we find on the end of the bracelet is a single scene on each of them. It shows a woman standing between two lions with two palm trees behind her, date palm trees. The two lions are both standing upright on their feet, and each one has got one paw resting on the woman's shoulder. Well, is it a kind of artistic feature that we can see in parts of Assyria and parts of Egypt? So again, it's a rather sort of funny scene that nobody has really come up with an explanation for. Remember, most of the tombs at Cerveteri have been robbed. So we don't have very much to compare this with. Gold gets melted down very easily. One of the more surprising finds in the woman's part of the burial was this. It's a bowl about that diameter. It's made of silver, but it's been gilded. It's been covered with gold. So you've got a combination of these two very rich and important metals. But what's really fascinating is the scene inside this. It's relatively straightforward in some ways. You've got a lion attacking a bull there. But that's a palm tree. Palm trees don't really grow in Etruria. Surrounding that central scene, you've got a hunting scene, and you have up here, for example, a man with a spear fighting a lion. The lion has jumped on somebody who's fallen on the ground. The hairstyle of the man on the ground is more like an African hairstyle. Thick, curly hair. You've got a horseman over here, firing backwards with his bow and arrow. Well, this is the type of fighting that we associate with the Parthian people of Persia, the Parthian shot. So it's really a mixture of scenes there. And then around the outer edge, we've got a procession of soldiers. They're not wearing typical Etruscan armour. We can't really identify their armour, but they've all got round shields, and they're marching behind what is presumably a general on a horse there. So the grave goods found with the woman in this particular burial are really very exceptional. Not much was found with the male burial, rather oddly, or probably a lot more was found, but it just hadn't survived the almost 200 years since then. But what was found was very significant in that it consisted of a set of silverware for use in a symposium. A symposium, remember, is a Greek concept, a Greek cultural concept. All the guys get together, they sit down, drink wine, watch entertainment, dancers, musicians, and so forth. So this is symposium material. And what's even more fascinating is that some of this material either is made outside of Etruria or it copies objects from outside of Etruria. So this jug, for example, has a shape typical of jugs found in Cyprus in the early Iron Age. This small amphora, we think of amphora as big wine carrying jars, but the proper amphora is like this. It's a small thing here. This small amphora and this cup here are modelled on Corinthian types of pottery vessels. So again, you've got this rather mixture of stuff. Well, gold and silver objects apart, which is what most people go immediately to look at when they go to the Vatican Museum to look at this particular tomb, even more exceptional was this. It's a cauldron. It's a bronze cauldron with a group of griffins around the top. Well, the griffin is one of these mythological animals that comes from the Orient. It comes from much further east. The Phrygians, just a little bit west of here, Gordian, going into Phrygia proper, Eskişehir area, Kütahya area. The Phrygians were well known for their metalwork, and all the indications are that this was made in Phrygia, here in Anatolia. Now, all these objects don't necessarily mean that we've got direct trade contact. I'm not saying that the person buried here had a friend in Phrygia, and he said, would you please send me one of your nice cauldrons? Of course not. They would have come by a very roundabout route. Probably went into Syria first and then to Cyprus perhaps. You know, but it just shows you the extensive trade contacts. And these are all goods that would have been very expensive at that particular time. Well, unfortunately, as I've already said and stressed, most of the tombs at Cerveteri were opened and robbed a long time ago. But even with those, we can still learn a lot about Etruscan everyday life to a certain extent, as well as burial practices. Let's look, for example, at the tumulus we know as the Tomb of the Shields and Chairs. Well, here you've got an entrance passageway, you've got the earth tumulus on the top, carved out of the rock, it's all carved deep into the rock. The entrance passageway goes down a very short way. And what we find ourselves in when we go through here is a series of rectangular chambers, all carved from the rock. This is the typical plan of the Cerveteri tombs, this sort of thing. So you go down the entrance passageway, you've got a room or chamber on that side with beds in it for the dead bodies, one over there, a large entrance area, and again a series of rooms at the back with beds in them for the dead bodies. Well, everything about this plan suggests it copies a house. We find in later Roman architecture houses built with this general type of plan. Entrance passageway, 2 rooms on either side, large open area, a set of rooms at the back. What makes it look even more and more like a house is carved out of the rock. We have this series of circular shields. They're meant to represent soldiers' shields hanging on the walls. Here we see the beds on which the dead people, the body of the dead person would have been placed. And notice they've got stone pillows as well to keep their head comfortable. And set around that open area, just like in the entrance area of a house, this wonderful series of carved chairs. It's almost as if what we're looking at is a house for the dead, literally a house for the dead soul. So that when they come back in spirit form, they can recognize the things they lived with, the beds, the chairs they sat on, that sort of thing. This idea is made very clear when we look at another tomb at Cerveteri, slightly later, roughly 575-600, the Tomb of the Reliefs. All carved underground, the same type of plan as the Tomb of the Shields and Chairs. Beds set around the edges of the big room, but look at all these carvings on the side. Study them in detail. What do we see? Well, you can see there's a length of rope there, the sort of thing you'd have hanging on the walls in a working house. An axe, can't quite be certain exactly what that is there. A sword, a wine jug probably over there, a wine drinking cup over there, armour along the back, a pair of greaves for protecting the lower leg, also a sword there, various other objects over here. Now it's almost as if the person this tomb was made for wanted to live in a representation of his own house. And of course, when we look at the type of finds that were made in the Cerveteri tombs, we see the same things repeated in many ways. So over there is that. It's the same sort of thing as everyday life. Well, going on from the Tomb of the Reliefs, this final detail here, just to make out the point again, another one of these hanging Corinthian type cups, the man's helmet and his sword and shield hanging up at the back, and the greaves over there as well. A representation of a griffin, something that's come from Eastern architecture, and this very strange figure that looks as if it's half man, half sea snake, something like that. The Etruscans get the idea of monumental tomb architecture from the Greeks. They also get the idea of temples from the Greeks. Now, Paestum we've already looked at. In Magna Graecia, there's reasonably good building stone. Not terribly good, limestone. It's possible to make a typical Greek temple in Magna Graecia using stone like this. At Etruria doesn't have good building stone. The Etruscans get the idea of organised religion and temples, places of worship, or more places of worship, homes for the gods, from the Greeks. They don't have good building stone, so they develop a different type of architecture. They build a stone base, or podium, and on that they build a mud brick and wood temple. In addition, instead of having columns going all the way round the central room of a temple, as is Greek practice, that's the central room there, the columns go all the way round usually. The Etruscans developed the idea of only having columns at the front, very rarely columns along the side, never columns at the back. So you can see the differences between Etruscan architecture, temple architecture, and Greek. Etruscan temples are on a podium, 1 metre, 2 metre high, steps at the front, columns at the front. Greek temples, columns all the way round. You can go up little steps around the side of a Greek temple as well. We know from archaeological evidence that these temples were generally very elaborately decorated. The best evidence we have comes from a place called Veii in Etruria. The temple here was destroyed possibly by the Romans in the 6th century or 5th century, can't be certain, or a bit later. But for some reason most of the temple architecture which could survive was buried in pits. And what we see from the temple at Veii is obviously a basic characteristic Etruscan temple. This is a model showing you the steps at the front, the high podium, the wooden columns, because there is no suitable building stone. But another difference between these temples and Greek temples is that they're very heavily decorated with terracotta statues. Terracotta is pottery that's fired to a temperature of between 300 and 500 degrees. Its flower pots are made of terracotta, so it soaks in water. It's used to protect the wood and the mud brick in the actual temple here. But it's got all the characteristics of a typical Etruscan temple. Columns at the front creating a porch, we call this a pronaos, and more particularly a series of terracotta statues along the roofline. We know these as acroteria. You can spell it with a C or a K, and I'll be talking a bit more about these in the next class, so I won't go into detail about them now. Another feature the Etruscans get from the Greeks, probably from Magna Graecia Greeks, is a change in domestic architecture and house planning, city planning. The house urns from the early period look like little village huts. The later house urns look more like rectangular houses with proper roofs on them. Marzabotto, an Etruscan colony built to the north of Etruria in the 6th century, built according to Greek principles of design with a regular street grid. Etruscan cities before this time are basically just large villages. Here we've got regular street grids. And in these regular street grids, houses, rectangular houses built on stone foundations, the still mud brick for the superstructure. But again, it's basically Greek influenced architecture. Well, I've given you a general introduction to the first part of the Villanovans and the Etruscans, and in the next class we'll be looking in more detail at the Etruscans as well. But what I want you to do now is to sign the attendance register so that I know you were here. So, Roman architecture and art. Well, the simple fact is that the archaeological evidence that we have indicates that there was really nothing or not very much at the site that becomes Rome until the middle of the 8th century. There's some evidence for Bronze Age activity there. So something going on there in about 1100 BC. But the first real evidence for occupation at the site of Rome dates to the middle of the 8th century. And the evidence shows that Rome essentially was nothing more than a small village until the 6th century BC. So what this means, if we want to understand the origins of the architecture and art of the Roman period, we've got to look at the architecture and art of the other peoples in Italy in the time before the 6th century BC. This is where, of course, we always have a problem. Archaeology is not very precise. But what our excavations throughout the whole of Italy have shown is that the beginnings of the Iron Age, so roughly 1000 BC, people in the northwest part of Italy were using the same type of pottery, impasto ware. Impasto ware is a rather greyish brown colour like this. It's rather simply made. It's not particularly beautiful or anything like this. But what we find in the northwest of Italy, in some parts of Bilkent, you get the idea of what we mean by a culture. So archaeologists refer to these people who are using the same types of pottery, living in the same types of villages, in a very restricted area. We call them the peoples of the Villanovan culture. Villanovan, because the first site where they were properly excavated was a place called Villanova, which means the new villa. This map shows you the Villanovan culture around about 8th century BC, so try and ignore that patch up there. We're really looking at this area here for the Villanovan culture. We know that the Villanovan peoples were just one of different groups of peoples living in Italy. When we get the first writing in Italy, we find out most people are speaking a different type of, or one or other of an Italian type language. But the area of the Villanovans, Etruria, a different language altogether. We do know that the Villanovan culture seem to have been the first people in Italy to start using iron. Well, that's not really surprising in a way, because the area of Etruria is incredibly rich in iron deposits. I'll come back to that in a moment. When we look at the common characteristics of the Villanovan people, we find that those that bury their dead in cremation burials usually buried them in what the Italians call a tombo apposa, which consists of a very large jar, roughly about that sort of high. Inside this would be a pottery urn for holding the burnt ashes of the dead person, and a few other bits and pieces. The area that in Roman times is known as Etruria is evidence for a series of villages in which all the people are using this type of pottery. These people are also burying their dead in one of two different ways. Some of the villages we find inhumation burials. An inhumation burial, the body is put in the ground, probably wrapped up in a cloth, but we don't know. But other villages practice cremation. So they burn the body before it's deposited in the ground. What we do know about these people seems to indicate they've got a common sort of lifestyle. They live in villages. They're using the same general type of pottery. But this is the time before written history. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what other peoples called them. All we know is that in the northwest part of Italy, the area that is known to the Romans, much later as Etruria, we have these people sharing the same types of pottery, same types of houses, not exactly the same types of burial methods. Now, for archaeologists dealing with times before written history, we use the word culture to identify a group of people that seem to share the same characteristics. I mean, if you look around Bilkent, you can identify a jeans culture. How many Bilkent students wear jeans? You know, it's that type of thing. A jet phone culture. There's also an iPad culture. And you can see, for example, it's a place where there is copper. Copper is needed to make bronze. But the area of Etruria is also one of the very few areas in Europe where you can find tin. And you need tin to mix with copper to make bronze. So you can see that from an early date in the Bronze Age, there's good evidence for bronze work in this particular region. There's also quite large deposits of mercury. Where you need mercury for gold working, gold extraction, there's large deposits of silver as well. And I mentioned in the introductory class how the island of Elba is full of hematite. Hematite is the raw material from which we make iron. And on this diagram they've indicated with these green blocks where hematite was found, including an island you're all familiar with, Giglio Island, where a rather large ship went aground when the captain was having a party the other week. So Giglio Island, which is just down here. The ship was actually sailing from Civitavecchia, which is just over there. These very rich metal deposits meant that from an early date, in the Bronze Age already, traders from other parts of the Mediterranean were coming to this region to get metal, to take it back to their own region, to work it into different types of metal goods. And what we do find in some Villanovan graves is wonderful evidence for this type of trade contact. We see this in well, these tomba apposa are very important to us because these house urns give us an indication of what Villanovan houses look like. We do have some archaeological evidence for Villanovan houses at the beginning of the Iron Age, so 1000 BC down to about 800 BC. They're made of mud brick and wood. No stone is used in them. Very simple houses like this. This is one of these house urns, but it gives us an idea of what the Villanovan houses would have looked like. This is an archaeological example showing the wooden framework. These are what we call post holes, wooden post in there supporting a simple wooden roof. And again, we've got another example of a house urn there showing us the same type of details that we can see in the archaeological evidence. In fact, if you go to some parts of central Italy today, you'll find that shepherds still build huts very much like this, although usually with a stone foundation rather than being entirely of wood. We don't really know very much about the Villanovan culture when all is said and done. We can see their artifacts, their weapons, they had a very characteristic form of architecture. But we do know for certain, as I've already mentioned, is that the area that the Villanovan culture people occupied is an area rich in metal deposits. This gives you some idea of the type of metal deposits to be found in what the Romans knew as Etruria. We don't know what this region was called at the beginning of the Iron Age.